the stuff I'm really finding valuable from a business perspective, I feel like I could have gotten some other way than through a really expensive MBA program.
You got to speak in the language of the business. Well, how do I do that? I was trained in software development and I don't know how to do that. Value to customers is different than value to employees, is different than value to investors. There's what are you going to do? And then there's how are you going to get it funded? And then there's how are you going to execute? And the rest doesn't matter because you're going to be sitting in the corner with Milton, right? The stapler guy in the basement.
Welcome, everybody. This is Tuesday Morning Grind, episode number 57. And today we're going to have a good conversation. There's this phenomena that happens where if you are a security leader, sometimes you never rise to the ranks of getting a seat at the table with leadership. And from my perspective, one of the reasons that happens is just a lack of business acumen. So who we have today is Matthew Sharp. Matthew literally wrote a book on security leaders acquiring business acumen and why that's important. He's also a CISO himself, advisory board member for some great organizations and been in security a long time. Matt, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Likewise, Christian. Excited to, dive into the chat.
Absolutely. So let's just start off with a quick background. You're a security leader. You wrote a book on security, but how did you even get into the space?
It was an accident. I think.
I hear that so many people say that. It was funny.
Yeah, I was writing software actually for a small 3D animation company just after college, and I didn't want to write code. In hindsight, now I've circled back and started writing Python for fun. But at the time, I didn't want to write code. So I interviewed at Coalfire and I interviewed at Chili's, and luckily I got the job at Coalfire. So yeah, that was that was the start.
Was there something that sparked your interest for security that you thought that was a cool career, or did you just kind of take a shot and apply?
I think I was probably just lobbing in applications at the time. I wanted to do. I was dying to be MCSE. That's what I was absolutely like super eager to do, was be a system admin, and I got an opportunity to do some system administration. Actually, under a really good team at Coalfire. They had some really smart folk that were doing it, and just gosh, you're taking me way back. Anyway, yeah, it was good. So I started building systems for pen testers and other folks at way back early days of Coalfire. I think fewer than 10 people and less than a couple, like maybe a couple $1 million of revenue for them. And so I was first just helping folks debug why their laptops were not working when they're trying to run vulnerability assessments, and then I ended up getting pushed into a revenue generating role, and sort of things took off from there. So, yeah.
So you have this technical background where you're working in Python, then you aspire to become a system administrator. You kind of sideways get into security consulting through the opportunity at what the time was a startup. When did you realize that there was a gap? Because the book you wrote is all about like security leadership and funding and valuation and budgeting and finance. But your background is technical, it sounds like. When did you realize, or how did you realize that there's this like gap between security practitioners needing all of this business acumen?
Yeah, I used to go to, when I was younger, I went to every conference or local meetup group that I could go to. So I was constantly at ISACA or ISSA or Rocky Mountain Internet Group or OWASP, whatever I could go to. And I kept hearing these repeated themes, and the repeated themes were it was something like, and I talk about this in the either we talk about it in the intro or the conclusion. You got to speak in the language of the business. And so then afterwards, I would go up and talk to folks who would say these things on stage, and I would say, "Well, how do I do that? Like, how do I do that? I want to know. Your content says I should talk in the language of the business, but I was trained in in software development. I came through a CS program at the University of Colorado, and I don't know how to do that. So how do I get those skills? And eventually, I ended up going and getting an MBA because I thought that that was the thing that we needed to do. And in my opinion, we can probably do better, and up level folks' skills without having to push them through, $100,000 investment and a couple of years in school. So that was that's the genesis of the book.
So I got an MBA too, and I'm kind of on the fence about it. I think the longer I am away from having done the MBA, the more valuable I think it is. So maybe it's like rose-colored glasses where I reflect on it fondly. But during the MBA, I was kind of I was kind of in the same boat as you. I was like, a lot of these, like the stuff I'm really finding valuable from a business perspective, I feel like I could have gotten some other way than through a really expensive MBA program. So, and then, so how my experience was, I was doing an MBA program. I was also working during that and doing like virtual CISO/CISO work. So I was able to apply a lot of the lessons in real time. And, you hear things about like startups doing business evaluations, doing simple budgeting meetings, understanding a business model and how security fits into that business model. That was my experience. Is that kind of your experience where you were kind of seeing in real time, like how the business objectives are somehow informing the security budgets and objectives, or did you experience it a different way?
Yeah, very much. I mean, so I was a consultant for years and years, and I had seen, like, by the time I got to, getting the chance to run a security program, I had basically a folder full of consulting engagements with all of the deliverables we had given to all of these, Fortune 500 companies. Um, and I had a pretty good idea on how to operate each of the different independent disciplines within InfoSec. And then I was in uh, an MBA program at the time, and I was working at Crocs. And so each time we would cover a new topic, I would go and take the chance to conduct an interview with one of the business leaders inside the company. Um, so we do a section on marketing, or I would finish up my marketing class, and then I'd go and strike up a conversation with our CMO. So yeah, that through that process, uh, I got to really see where theory and execution deviates from an operator perspective for all
Mm-hmm.
these different disciplines in business. Um, and then in the process, I really wanted to capture my learnings. So I actually wrote one blog, I think back in 2015 or 2016, and my intent was to just chip away on each of these classes and write a blog for each of them, post it up on LinkedIn. And then I never did it. It got busy. So yeah, very much the same thing.
Yeah. When I think about, so maybe it's easier. Most security practitioners, I think, came in it like maybe me or you did, because I started in consulting where you're doing tasks, you learn about security, then you start managing projects. But what I was missing, I think, I was promoted quickly, just like it sounds like you were, and then you're eventually promoted into a leadership position, but your whole career has been in security. The important gap for me at the time was I didn't understand fully the top level executives' perspective. And that what I was missing was these guys have huge budgets. They're worried about market conditions. They're probably making strategic acquisitions. They're paying attention to the competitive landscape. They're worried about customer turnover, new product features, maybe even new opportunities they're trying to seize, which takes up basically all of their intellectual horsepower. And thereby they deprioritize security unless there's a breach that's company threatening, which is why it gets prioritized to the top. From your experience, like what is it like? What is that link between business and security? Are there trends that you're seeing in terms of like business types or different types of executives that, because of whatever way they're situated in the organization, they are concerned about security? So I'm asking for that cheat sheet. How do we get executives to pay attention to security when they already have so much on their plate, their heads in so many places? Like, what is that business objective that ties security to the business?
I think it's the value agenda. Like if you go into the room and you talk about the things that they're talking about, and you represent to them that there's a risk in delivering successful outcomes, the things that they're actually trying to deliver, and that investing in security can actually produce a positive outcome for them, the dialogue changes. So I go back to the investment class that we're talking about the MBA now.
Mm-hmm.
The investment class basically says there are ways that you can take stocks that perform in different market conditions. So when uh, when when monetary policy is loose, then this particular type of stock tends to do very well. So then you might also take, instead of a stock, you might invest in T-bills or something else that's going to perform with the opposite direction. And you can layer these two things together, and you can produce basically a less risky outcome, where you have less volatility in the investment that you've made, right? So the same thing is true in the project work that you do, and the way that you can talk to folks, in my opinion, is by understanding what are their goals and what are they trying to get out of whatever the investment they're making, and then talking about how you're going to reduce the risk related to that particular, either the execution of that project or you know the make yourself more resilient to market conditions, or I don't know, it depends on exactly what you're trying to do. But I think if you're in the room and you're talking to somebody about them, you're always more interesting. And so that's if you're talking about the business and the thing that the business is trying to deliver, then um, your angle just happens to be cybersecurity. How are we going to do this in a safe way so that we optimize the outcome? How we optimize the value potential?
How much time do you take to understand a company's business model? And and is there any link between like business models and how important security is?
Yeah, I think that there is certainly some link between business models and how important cyber is. I mean, I'll rephrase or reframe what you said. You said security, and I'm going to turn it into an information security. So, I think the World Economic Forum talks about um, 60% of global GDP is going to be digitized, and 70% of the value created in the economy over the next decade is going to be based on digital platforms. So, you know, the relevance of how digital is your business is going away. All businesses are digital now, but that wasn't the case 5, 6, 10 years ago, right? So you can look back and even recall a time where MasterCard said that they were going to go from becoming a financial services business to a technology business. And then of course you've seen, everybody wants to be the Uber of something. Um,
Yep.
so I think that's less and less the case. I think all businesses now have a digital component, and the question is how much value is that generating for the business at the moment?
Yeah, there's certain business models. Like one of the things I like to do when I'm thinking about, especially our customers and prospects, is like there's certain business models where you just know that security is going to come up. And a good example that maybe isn't intuitive is, for example, I know that let's take a scaling startup. They're what is going on as a scaling startup? All right, one, I know that they're probably trying to get funding, so they're going after private equity, venture capital. If they get it, I know that they're probably very interested in explosive growth. Why is that the case? Because they're going to get capital, they're going to get money from an investor, and then the investor is looking for a 4 to 10x return. So that startup has to grow by 10x. So just because I understand that ecosystem, I understand their objective is growth, I understand there's investors involved, I know that the investor needs a return on investment. What does hypergrowth mean for security? Well, hypergrowth means there's going to be a ton of employee onboarding and offboarding. That's a security thing. There's going to be a ton of change and focus on products. So maybe DevSecOps is important. Maybe because they're a startup, I know their ecosystem is going to be something like a cloud environment. So I think about those kind of things when I think about how a business model or a company's stage of growth might impact their security program. And then when I walk in and talk to the board of directors about security, like I know the board, who are the investors, are hyper focused on growth trajectory. So for me, I'm like, I'm going to frame a lot of security in the form of like value protection, their ability to sell into certain markets, helping them scale the business rapidly, that type of thing. I give that whole discussion right there because you wrote about this a lot. I think you mentioned it was chapter 4 of your book. You have like a whole chapter that's based on security and value of a business. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is that chapter all about? Why is that important?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think at the front end of the chapter, we review, we go through a dialogue about what is value, and we
Mm-hmm.
talk about the 5 W's and the, who, what, where, when, and why of value. And that plays a really important role because, value to customers is different than value to employees, is different than value to investors. And at the end of the day, if you want to be in the boardroom, then you got to talk to the investors and you got to speak about the value that they care about. And so that was kind of the early part of the chapter. Then we go ahead and talk about different mechanisms for delivering value, and we talk about different valuation models. We dissect down different types of investors, so strategic and financial investors, hedge funds, venture, and PE. And so, basically, we're giving you a background so that you can understand who is your audience and how to properly frame things. And then um, and then of course we actually do spend some time exploring how to directly dissect a business from its supply and demand side, and then connect to the value agenda, whatever that happens to be. So I think in the chapter we actually take a hypothetical company which pretty closely reflected where Pepsi was at when I wrote the chapter, and then we connect it to some hypothetical earnings calls and some other conversations with FP&A folks at the lunchroom table or something like that. But uh,
So I feel like this is probably hyper intuitive to you, but for the average security professional, I don't think that they're thinking like, most security professionals, they're thinking, I got to get my XYZ certification. I have to become an expert in, AWS or Azure or whatever it might be. It seems like a pretty common blind spot is I don't imagine many security practitioners are thinking, hey, I need to learn about valuation of a business and what the investors care about and what the earnings calls are looking like. It seems like a bridge pretty far apart from security to that. So can you like maybe provide an example? Like what's an example of like let's just say in your Pepsi example, or maybe a startup or something, like how is that connected? How does a security practitioner use that information to inform how they're going to develop their program?
yeah, well, I mean, there's what are you going to do, and then there's how are you going to get it funded, and then there's how are you going to execute,
Mm-hmm.
right? So first you got to identify what changes need to be made. Then you got to convince somebody else of that so they give you the money. Those are steps 1 and 2. If you can't get them, if you can't identify things that need to be done and get the money, then the rest doesn't matter because you're going to be sitting in the corner with Milton, right, the stapler guy in the basement. Um, so yeah, I mean, um, I think we talk about uh, an example is information governance. So we wanted to fund an information governance project at some point in my career, and we were struggling to figure out how to do that. At the same time, there was an edict that came out from finance team that said we need to cut 1% or 3% or whatever of SG&A costs. So IT fits in that bucket. So does the cyber team. And so what we ended up finding was that there were some challenges with the way that legal was doing particular legal holds, and that was causing an increase in the amount of data that we were capturing, and we were capturing that using a really expensive IBM-based tool that had this exorbitant licensing cost. So at the end of the day, we funded our entire InfoSec program by identifying basically cost avoidance opportunities using information governance, and that was sort of right on the precipice or the leading edge of the release of GDPR. And so, of course, having an awareness of what data you have and where it's stored um, naturally leads into all of those other conversations. And then we augmented it with a risk reduction thing because GDPR has the potential for fines, 4% of revenue, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an
Yeah.
example.
So if you're a security professional and you've never thought of security this way, when I think about security, I think there's typically three primary drivers. There's risk reduction, so I don't want to breach. There is cost containment. So as you just outlined, I can reduce complexity. I can reduce cost of audits. I can reduce data collection or storage costs. There's ways to reduce costs through security. And then there's sales or revenue generation. So I have to get XYZ certification to do business with this prospect. So a lot of times when I'm going through and thinking about how I'm going to talk to a board about a given scenario, I use that as a starting point to say they probably care about one of those three: making money, reducing risk, cutting cost. And in the scenario you gave, you identified that, hey, they want to reduce SG&A by 1%. So obviously they're in cost cutting mode. How can I use this security initiative to help them accomplish their business objective? Does that happen naturally for you, or do you use that as a framework? Are you always in a quest for like what management's top level objective is, or is it just kind of intuitive to you to do that?
It's a game. It's a fun game for me. I think I spent a lot of time, like I said, in a lot of conversations with a lot of people, thinking about the answer to how do you actually speak to the business in the business language, and I had a bunch of theories and ideas on how that might work, sort of before I decided to finally take an MBA workload. And so I don't know. I think it's one of the more interesting components of what we do. Like if you can connect what we do to the value agenda, if you can directly tie it to how to what people care about, then suddenly people care about information security. So I
What do you think you're doing to find out? Like, are you reading stuff? Are there things that you just have the habit of reading in terms of internal documents? Do you do interviews? Because even you mentioned while you were doing your MBA, you would like take it upon yourself to go talk to the marketing executive or whatever to tie this thing together. So are there tips you have, or like, how do you acquire such information to get a beat on what leadership cares about?
Yeah, I think if you're in a publicly traded company, you got to start with the annual report. And if you pick that thing up and you don't know what the heck it says, then you should go ask someone. Um, and so that's kind of where I started. I remember, you know, being in the conversations. I had access at the time to the Bloomberg terminals, and I had access to Mergent Online and a bunch of other techniques to like dissect and profile these businesses. And the reason that people have access to those things is primarily so that you can figure out what the stock is worth, right? And we were doing a bunch of valuation stuff at the time, and and so we held an earnings call, and we had brought on, I think at the time, a new CEO, and it was a pretty domestic sort of calm, relaxed call, and then we had the internal conversation. And it's not uncommon for executives in publicly traded companies to present one story to the investment community, and a pretty starkly different conversation comes out to the employees, because again, value is different, and they're tailoring their message to the audience. So in the employee version, they're talking about getting excited about some new programs and talking about how we're giving back to community and connecting to people. And in the investor thing, they're talking about how we're reducing costs by eliminating 50 stores that that quarter or whatever. And then they talk about some of the leading performance indicators and some other things. And I just remember asking questions during the all hands meeting about some of the things that they said in the investment meetings. And at that point, it became very, very apparent that the vast majority of people inside of public companies are not participating or listening to earnings calls. And if they do, they're not then taking that information and going and having conversation with others. So yeah, I started to see this stuff crop up all over the place. Like you would go to I went to this pizza place, Marco's Pizza, I want to say, and I look up on the wall and there's like all of these goals about revenue and EBITDA. And I said to the guy who's standing in front of it, do you know what EBITDA is? Do you know what revenue is? Like, how is this driving, behavior inside the business or whatever? So I don't know, maybe just a curiosity. But yeah, you got to start. You got to read the annual. You got to read the annual report, the proxy statements, and some of that stuff if you're in a publicly traded company.
One thing I kind of realized is when you start asking good questions, is people are very willing to have when you realize that information is available, you suddenly realize that it's widely available, even at non-public companies. Like there's almost always a quarterly all hands call or some materials you can find. And then same for public companies. But then when you start escalating and you ask like the finance manager or the director of finance or the director of strategy, they're often excited to have that conversation with you. We have a work stream that we do a lot for different certifications and also for like virtual CISO services where we do a risk assessment. And I think when most people think of a security risk assessment, they think, threats, vulnerabilities, assets, very technical. But a big part of the risk assessment we do is like talking to leadership, hearing about their business objectives, their business models, what are they concerned about? That way we can align the security programs to that. And when we first started doing those, I was a little nervous because I thought maybe we were stepping outside of our pay grade and they were going to be a little bit hesitant to talk about their strategy and their product and stuff. But instead, what we found out was people were very willing to have those conversations and were excited that we were thinking about building a security program that was going to be nested or support those business objectives. So if you're a security practitioner, I think that there's almost zero risk in respectfully asking good questions like that and searching for the information. That's been my experience. Have you ever have you had a similar experience, Matt, or do you get pushback when you start asking those kind of questions?
I was terrified. I mean, I was terrified to go look like an idiot, right? Like
Yeah.
the first handful of conversations that I went out into the business and started asking these questions, I was taking theory to them and saying, this is what I learned. Like, is this what you actually do? And you're supposed to be an executive, so you're supposed to, you're supposed to know these things, and you're supposed to, um, I don't know, I just had this expectation that other people in the business anticipated that I knew this stuff. So I felt like they were definitely excited to hold the conversations. And there's the old saying, we don't know how much you care how much you know until you know how much you care or whatever. And I feel
Yeah.
like that applies in this situation. Like the second that executive team members knew that I understood where they were coming from, um, all of a sudden doors started to open up, and I was allowed to go and travel to Shenzhen and do tours of factories and tooling locations to identify how was IP leakage happening, and all of these other things started to happen. But it wasn't until those conversations were held that that started to happen.
There's, I think, one reason to have an understanding of the business and the business objectives is to cater your message to get what you need from a security program perspective. But I also suspect the other thing that happens is as you acquire more business acumen and you get more in touch with what the business is trying to accomplish, why they're trying to accomplish, your asks are probably more reasonable and more in alignment with business. So not only can you communicate the want, but you're also more in tune and asking for better requests. Do you think that because you have solid business acumen, because you have this model that you've built for yourself to understand a business and how that links to security, it's changed like how you approach security or how you prioritize things? Or are you still using the same old playbook, just different language?
I think as I've gotten greater perspective, I think Dave Hannigan is one of the guys who has taught me a lot in the last couple of years. He used to be at Spotify and Capital One before that, and he's at Google now. And he said, never forget that there's somebody who has the unenviable task of making a decision um, that basically prioritizes something else over the security concern that you're raising. Somebody somewhere has to make that decision. So, in a lot of ways, it's kind of nice to be the security person once you've got the appropriate forums and you're communicating in the appropriate language, because you don't actually have to make the decisions in a lot of ways, right? Like you're not the person who decides the final budget. You're not the person who has to say, who has to adjudicate yes and no and weigh the balance between financial, strategic, legal, market risk, as well as the cyber risk. So I think I think that definitely is one of the changes that happened. Is I appreciated, like you mentioned, maybe at the front end of the call, the much more difficult challenging decisions, and also the level of risk and the concept of risk that folks are facing on a regular basis. I hope that the requests got more meaningful. I mean, I think the piece that I would add that you didn't really say, which is the primary area where I focused a lot on, was how are we? So in my program today, we do three things: we accelerate sales, we protect the brand, and we influence product. That's what we do, in that order. And so there's a big focus on accelerating sales, which is opening access to markets, making sure that we're inspiring trust with our customers. And then on the back end, it might not be necessarily reducing costs because we're a growth business, but it might be making sure that we can safely gain access to labor markets that can reduce our overall operating costs, or that can give us access to a broader talent pool or whatever. So um, I think I think that the requests are probably just the same as they were before, but the way that they're being heard is, "Hey, can I help you make sure that when we open access to this new talent pool, that we're doing it in a way that doesn't expose our intellectual property, which has a direct impact on our end valuation." That's a totally different request than, "I need an identity and access management tool in order to make sure that you know, I've got a strong user lifecycle management," or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the what largely remains intact. Like, you still need an identity and access management tool. You still need vulnerability scanning. You still need XYZ. But being able to articulate the why, or as you would put it, the value to the appropriate audience is paramount, because you understand how identity and access management is relevant to a business leader, and you're going to cater the message to them. Versus you understand why identity and access management might matter to your team who's doing identity and access management. It's going to make their job easier. And fine tuning your discussion with the relevant party is going to ultimately help you gain influence. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's takes a lot of patience and thought and pragmatism as a leader to say the same thing 10 different ways to 10 different people, because you need that message to be received in a certain way.
I also felt like early in my career that I was lying if I changed the message, you know?
Yeah. Feels inauthentic. It can.
Yeah. Like at times, if I was saying one thing to one person and then I turn around and describe the exact same initiative a completely different way, it felt like, I came from a very pure, technical background. And so initially I didn't value sales, and I didn't value, personal influence. I was one of those guys that said, if you have to talk to a sales guy, that they're inherently like, scheming they're lying to line their pockets or whatever. And of course that's not the case. And of course business doesn't work without sales. And of course, um, influence is then, we actually talk about choice architecture and influence strategies, and we give entire frameworks on how to do this stuff, stakeholder analysis maps, and all of that, so that you can customize the way that you present your business cases. So, yeah.
You talk about this in the book. Is that what you're referring
Yeah.
to? Nice.
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
So you brought up a good point, and I want to get to the book too, because I'm interested in like how the heck you wrote the thing. But the thing about authenticity and lying and like feeling weird about it, because I had the exact same phenomena. Like, it feels very unnatural to say one thing to someone. For example, I'll use my identity and access management. Tell the leadership team, hey, this is going to help us access markets and get a different talent pool and remain secure. Like, we can offshore some stuff, whatever. Like, you present it to them in one way, then go to your staff that's on your security team and talk about how much more secure it's going to make you. It can feel very inauthentic, like you're speaking out of both sides of your mouth, and at least that's how I felt. But then if you back it up and you're like, well, hold on a second. The way I think about it now is like, I'm trying to be highly empathetic. And if I'm going to make a presentation or just prepare for a meeting, the first thing I always start with is like, why does this person care, or why do they need to know this? Like, how's it going to impact them? Because you said earlier, like, people, they're highly interested when you talk about how it's going to impact them or their story. And the executive has a very different concern and risk and desires than, say, the staff IT person. And so like it's not manipulative, it's a requirement. You have to think about what they need to know to be able to make a decision. And that's how I think about it now with, I guess, more maturity and more reps under my belt. But you're absolutely right. I think it can feel inauthentic, and that's not what we're advocating. That's not what you're advocating. It's thinking about the why. Why does that person need to know? We're not trying to trick anyone or fool them into or manipulate them into going with our suggestion. It's really an authentic thing where you're just like, hey, here are the facts. Here's why we might need this. Here's how it's going to impact you in the business. Can you help? Can you make a decision with that? And let the cards fall where they may, but it's the right way to present that. It's an authentic kind of thing, not an inauthentic thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can absolutely trick a business into doing security. Um, at some point when I interviewed for the role that I'm in, I went to an insurance company, and the insurance company told me we don't have Wi-Fi in our building, and I was like, "Wow, why? What are you talking about?" This was 5 years ago. It's not, and they said our security person has scared us all to not put in Wi-Fi, so we don't have Wi-Fi in our entire building, which was mind-boggling. So yeah, I mean, imagine how that's really limited the progress of the business. Um, and so I would absolutely say that there are some number of people out there that are over investing in security at the expense of their business. I still don't think that's the majority of folks today.
Yeah, I agree. I want to talk about the book a little bit because I'm always fascinated by the not just the fact that like the contents of the book, but the discipline it takes to get a book produced. So can you talk about that? Like, how did you decide that like you had something worth writing down? What was the writing process? Did you get up at 7 o'clock every morning and like mandate an hour out of yourself? What was all that like?
Yeah. Well, here's what actually happened. This is kind of embarrassing. I went to, I had the opportunity. I was invited to participate in a panel, by Merlin, who's a CISO who's based in the Colorado market. That's where I used to live. And we had this phenomenal panel, and I also had an opportunity to do a birds of a feather. So birds of a feather, because I didn't know this, is basically a round table at RSA, and you just talk about a particular topic. So I spent all of this time talking to these super intelligent people with these very cloud forward businesses about what are the major complexities in terms of securing budget for the cloud, because like you do an acquisition, there's no security folks over there. All of a sudden, you have a new cloud altogether. You know all about AWS, but now you got to tackle Azure or GCP. Um, the telemetry is tenfold what it used to be. So who's carrying the cost burden of aggregating and storing that, and so forth and so forth. We got all the way out there after all of these very inspired conversations that I had in private. And I sat down at the desk, and nobody came. The only person that came was my co-author. The only person. And so we sat there and we talked about all of these topics. And there's a number of really great cloud examples throughout the book we talk about. Um, and it became apparent that either we did a terrible job promoting, um, people are not just not ready for the conversation yet. People felt insecure or unsafe or vulnerable having a conversation because there was so much ignorance, or people just lack the business acumen in order to tackle these topics. And we kind of decided it was probably a combination of all of it. I'm not, famous. I'm not a the CISO of Walmart or something like that, right? So maybe I didn't draw the most crowd, but in the end we decided that we had something to say, and whether people were listening or not, if you go to enough CISO dinners, you also see some repeated trends, and you can identify that people that are saying things and kind of like, that guy's full of shit. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know how his business actually functions. And so, yeah, so we spent a month, we spent a week, a day a week for 8 months, fine tuning the story of exactly what we wanted to say. And it was formulated around basically Rock's MBA program in mind. And then we pitched it, and we sold the book without anything other than basically an outline written. And then we had to go and write the thing. So it became wake up at 6 and get to work. And I did that basically every day for a year. And I only wrote a half a book. So yeah, huge commitment. And Rock did the same thing on his end. And so for us, collaborating with the co-author, there's some other logistics that you have to come up with, like how are we going to structure each chapter so we don't get to the end and like my chapters don't match your chapters, and that really helped us think about how we were going to, structure each chapter. And then we also had to dissect things, and there were certain topics that I'm more passionate about, and certain topics that he's more passionate about. Um, and we have really opposing views. Like he and I are polar opposites in basically every way. Like everything from I like a White Rascal and he drink a Guinness to opposing political views to where we live to just I mean like there's so many things that we disagree on. So yeah, so it was a good journey, a good opportunity to sort of constantly challenge the concepts that I was dealing with and bounce them off of somebody who had, opposing views.
Was it like an iron sharpens iron thing where you would review each other's chapters or at least some of the ideas of the chapter to kind of refine them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so a lot of the chapters that I wrote, like you mentioned, were related to, we'll say, technical business concepts. So a lot of financial accounting, that kind of acumen. A lot of the chapters that Rock wrote were much more focused around soft skills. Although I did write the negotiation chapter at the end. And so yeah, I think the two of us were coming at the book from very different perspectives, and then also being aware of like what had I just written over here in chapter 4, because I wrote chapters basically 1 through 6, and he was writing the other ones in the back. And so some of the concepts were coming along at the same time. Like there were moments when I was writing about decision science and influence strategies, and he was talking about building a governance framework and connecting to the board of directors. And so obviously those are tightly integrated. So we had a lot of collaboration along the way. We still have an hour every Friday. I jokingly say I've spent more time with Rock over the pandemic than I did with my wife. Um, I don't know if that might actually be true. So
Well, excellent. So I guess the book is targeted for senior level managers, folks entering the executive ranks, or anybody in between that wants to kind of understand the executive way of thinking or those business skills that will link to security. As of today, when does the book come out? When can we expect the book? Is it still slated to be like early January?
yeah, the book drops January 26th. So we'll get the printed version will come out then, and then a few weeks after that, we'll get the book released in digital format. So we're lucky because our publisher has already hired and contracted with folks, and they're doing the recording on the book. So pretty excited to actually see, to pull something off and then have it in digital format, both written digital format and audiobooks.
So if you're listening to this around or after January 26th, you can buy the book. It's called CISO Evolution. There's also a website, cisoevolution.com. Can they pick it up on Amazon, or they need to go to the website to get it?
Yeah, all major. I mean, it's a tier one publishing company, so it'll be available everywhere. You can get it. You'll be able to get it everywhere that you want it. But it's available now. You can actually pre-order on Amazon today. It's a little funny with the search because Cisco and CISO are two confusing terms. It a lot of times will autocorrect. So if you type the CISO evolution, then you'll find it.
Awesome.
Some folks have not been able to find it.
What's next for you and Rock? You guys going to go on a speaking tour or something? Or are you guys just going to keep consulting? You going to do anything like that?
Man, well, we'll see. I mean, hopefully the book gets some good traction and we get some good reviews. And I think there's a hunger and a desire for folks to to develop these foundational business skills, and I think they marry into a lot of the content that's out there today. So you think about what the Digital Directors Network is doing, and you think about some of the new evolving regulatory reporting requirements and board structure requirements, and like the evolving SEC laws and all of that. I think all of this will continue to highlight what's what's already known, which is boards have an increasingly huge appetite to receive information that they can understand about cybersecurity. For now, I think the next steps for us, honestly, are just to, we're going to try to get the book positioned in maybe in a couple of MBA programs. We're going to see how COVID plays out. And then once that sort of subsides, I think he's got a couple of CISO roundtable things that are being coordinated locally. And then he's going to partner up with some security vendors who are going to fund some marketing. And then, he'll go on the road with them. So
that's awesome. So if you guys are interested in, I guess, getting a seat at the table, you're a security practitioner, you want to understand how to speak to business executives, how they think, how to get budgets approved, that link between the business objective and information security, I think this is a great place to start. This is something I'm seeing over and over again as I interact with any kind of management or executives. So that book's the CISO Evolution. You can find it on Amazon. You also have the website, cisoevolution.com. Matt, thanks so much for joining and sharing your knowledge and writing the book and helping make the industry a better place. I appreciate it.
Right on. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. Good chat.
Absolutely.
I like what you guys are doing.
Hey, thank you for watching Tuesday Morning Grind podcast. If you like content just like this from cybersecurity executives, thought leaders, hackers, then come on over to risk360.com. Check out our resource center where we have blog posts, white papers, videos, all for free that can teach you about cybersecurity. If you want to know more about cybersecurity certifications like ISO 27001, SOC 2, PCI, High Trust, and others, we have a ton of content on that. So whatever you're looking for, we have a lot of resources. Head on over to risk360.com, shoot us a note, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going.